Welcome to MPC's webinar on transforming research into an engaging policy story. I am Neha, your moderator for today, and this presentation will be conducted by Dr. Svetlana Kobzar. If you have any questions at any point during the presentation, please type in your questions in the attendee column, the question panel, given on the right-hand side of your screen. Today's agenda is as follows. The first would be the introduction, which I am giving as of now. The second will be followed by the presentation by Dr. Kobzar, and the final session will be a question and answer session. So I'll just run you through the technical issues of this webinar. In case if you have any queries during the session, please do not hesitate to contact me. As you can see on your right-hand side of the screen, there will be a control panel for attendees. The column on your top of the control panel is the click arrow button, which you can use to open or close the control panel. The second one is the click square panel, which is to toggle the viewer window between full screen and the window mode. And the third is the click hand icon to raise any questions or if you have any queries, and I can get back to you. This is the questions pane, which is where you can type in any queries during the session to either me or to our presenter today. If you have any kind of problems, technical issues, please let me know. I'm just going to test the hand icon as of now. Could you please raise your hand if you can hear me? Thank you very much. If there's any questions or any problems regarding if you cannot hear me properly or if the screen is not moving, then please do go ahead and type in your question down below here at the questions panel. Now I am going to hand over the presentation to Dr. Svetlana Kobzar. As mentioned earlier, she is working as a Wolfson Fellow at the Cambridge University, and today she's going to talk about her presentation on how to write policy briefs and how to effectively communicate with researchers and policymakers. So I hope this session is interesting for you, and if you have any questions for the presenter, please just type in at the question panel, and in the last session we will take it up. If you can hear me correctly, please raise your hand again before I hand over the session to Dr. Svetlana Kobzar. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to hand over the session to Dr. Kobzar.
Just a moment, I'm opening my slides. Yes, so I hope now you can see my screen. Please raise your hands if you don't. And thank you very much, Neha, for your introduction. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to present today. And if you have any questions, again, as I speak throughout the presentation, please note them and we can raise them in the Q&A in the end. So today's talk will be, as you already know, about writing a policy brief. And as Neha mentioned, my experiences span academia. So I'm a fellow at the Wolfson College at the University of Cambridge, and I'm also assistant professor at Vesalius College, Free University of Brussels. And I'm also engaged with policy analysis work. I'm based in Brussels and work for a policy research organization where I deal with a lot of day-to-day issues that involve policy writing and working with policymakers. So in my work, I constantly have to bridge the gap or bridge academia and trying to communicate it in a policy environment, the findings that we have. So I will reflect on my experiences of trying to do that, and also I will draw on the literature that I found in other disciplines, marketing and communications books, that I find helpful when trying to do that. So let's begin firstly by talking about key strategies briefly, what it involves writing for policymakers. I will then draw on the literature that I mentioned, and in particular I'll talk about how to make your ideas stick. I'll explain what I mean by stick later on. And we'll also touch upon briefly on different types of policy briefs and their main functions, and talk about do's and don'ts of trying to write them. And lastly, but very importantly, we'll talk about how to turn your research paper into a policy brief. And here we've worked to develop a template that can be helpful to you or anyone who's trying to turn their longer papers into shorter policy briefs, and the way to structure that and to start thinking about it early on. And the presentation will last about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have questions. So let's begin with key strategies. Obviously, the name policy brief already helps us to address this issue that we are writing for those interested in policy. This may involve policymakers, but it may also involve lobbyists or bureaucrats or those who are advising policymakers, NGOs. Basically, your audience is such that they are interested in policy but may not necessarily come from a research background. So that's crucial to keep in mind. And it's important because our colleagues researchers are quite likely to be interested in methodology and data sets and basically the path that you took to get to the results that you have. Oops, just a second. But policy audience are likely to have their time much more constrained, and also they may have a broader portfolio of different issue areas with which they deal with. So they may potentially look at the summary and conclusions and decide then whether to read the rest of the document and skim through it. And it's important because then it dictates the way we think about structuring our policy brief and making summary conclusions very much message-led and compact, but at the same time communicating our main message. So when trying to then think about how to construct a policy brief, three broad questions are worth keeping in mind, both in the beginning and then as you progress and as you finish writing it. One is, what is your core message? It's quite important, basically, as soon as you begin making progress on your research, to keep thinking about, so what is the core message that is emerging from that research, the single most important concept or the most impactful idea that may emerge from it. And then once you begin writing it, and especially as you reflect on your first draft, ask yourself, am I brief enough? Am I clear and straightforward in communicating it? Will the audience who may not be as well versed in the intricate details of that research be able to understand it? I can see that there are maybe some questions. Are there any emerging questions? I will continue with the presentation, and then if there are any emerging questions, please communicate them in the chat form, and that way we can address them through their as we go along. So the third important point is that why should policymakers care about it, but why should anyone who's reading it care about it? Obviously, we've done the research and it's quite likely we're passionate about it, but why would someone who's new to that, why should they care about it? Why the ideas that you communicate may have an impact? So now let's talk about these principles of having sticky ideas. And why sticky? By sticky, I mean ideas that are well understood and remembered, and that they have a lasting impact. The screen is taking its time to switch. So for just a second. And sticky ideas, they change your audience opinions and behaviors. Well, so basically, one is to be well understood, but potentially your ideas may have an impact and may actually impact policy in such a way that there may be some changes. And this proverb, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, is interesting because it's one of those sticky ideas. It's not necessarily kind of a policy brief kind of idea, but it's worth including it to communicate the point about stickiness of the ideas. And that is that some concepts, they travel through time. They don't have dissemination or advertising budget. However, people remember them and they pass them along and they mention them when they want to communicate a certain point. And it's important because I'm relying here in the section on the book written by Chip and Dan Heath, Made to Stick, that they argue that there are certain principles that are universal to different disciplines, but they help to communicate ideas in such a way that people remember them. And these principles include simplicity, unexpectedness, concreteness, credibility, emotion, and stories. So I will briefly talk about each principle. Now, the book has not been written for the purpose of writing policy briefs, far from it. It's just about, in general, communicating ideas. So I'll try to adapt these principles as they apply to our presentation for writing a policy brief. But bear in mind that some of these principles may be more applicable than others in this context. So the first one, and that's we already touched upon, and that's thinking early enough, and especially once you finish your research and write a policy brief, about the core of your message. What is the core of your findings from that research? That is kind of the most important one. And of course, it may be easy to cut. You'll have to cut some material from a longer paper into a shorter policy brief. So it may be easier, of course, to cut things that may be kind of include repetitions or may be not as important, maybe supporting some of the points you made in the longer paper, but not as crucial. But of course, it's very difficult to try to cut ideas that you think are still important. But for the policy brief, they may not be just the most important. So that's the part that is quite tricky and worth reflecting on early on, and also realizing that you will have to most likely have to do it. That's trying to decide important from the most important one. And it's challenging. It's challenging for a number of reasons. And again, here I'm reflecting on partly what I read and partly what I experienced myself. It's challenging because when you do research, you acquire this curse of knowledge. You know so much about the topic that you think a lot of things may be important. And so trying to address that challenge, it's almost you have to try to step away from being a knowledgeable researcher and look at it with the eyes of the beginner when trying to write a policy brief. What would someone who hasn't spent so much time on the topic would think, or how would they read it? What questions would they have? But of course, the second challenge, and it's not only applicable to researchers, it's applicable to our audience as well. That's this decision paralysis of trying to decide then which message to communicate, how to do it, and among various messages that you have. And here it's worth keeping in mind that this challenge is not just your challenge, but your audience has it too. Policymakers are bombarded with a lot of information, a lot of different messages. So the role of the policy brief should be actually trying to help them to overcome this decision paralysis, to trying to communicate your points in such a clear and strong way that it helps them to sift through a lot of information and distinguish the forest from the trees, especially in your domains. And you probably are much better placed in overcoming this decision paralysis and helping them, the audience, to overcome it than anyone else, since you know the topic quite well. But at the same time, the feedback that one receives sometimes when from researchers when they try to do it is how to make it simple enough but not dumb it down, not make it so simple that nuances are gone. And here it's important to stress the point that by simplifying or making it straightforward and concise, it doesn't mean taking away all the nuances or not communicating the complexity. It just it's actually a very challenging, but one of the most important things as well, in addition to communicating the core, and that is to be able to communicate that complexity and nuances, but in a simple way that that your audience will understand. And here I've looked into other disciplines, for example, journalism, how they try to communicate sometimes complex ideas. I mean, by that I mean good journalists and well-respected ones who try to communicate complex ideas, but to the general audiences or to well-educated audience. And I'm not asking here to try to turn into a journalist or to write in a journalistic style. Far from it. What I'm pointing in this slides is to look at the thinking that goes behind how information is structured and ordered, complex and difficult information, but in a way that is easily understood by a variety of audiences. And that is firstly looking what is most newsworthy. That's the point about what is the core of the message, who, what, when, where, why, how for the journalists. And then looking secondarily what are the important details that pertain to that core message. And then if you have time, or you can add it into your further reading and references, other general information and background information. Something perhaps may not go into the actual policy brief in this context, but it may still be able to capture your reader's attention, and they can follow up with that general and background information by following their works that you cite or things that you refer to in the end. So finding the lead for journalism is very important, and that is, going back to the point of having a very punchy and message-led introduction and conclusion, that if the readers just read that, they understand your points. For journalists, that's kind of the first few paragraphs. They include this lead that if readers read only the beginning, they understand it, the core message. That's very important. The second principle that Chip and Dan Heath talk about is this principle of unexpectedness. And that is, we have certain ideas about certain things and issues, and we have a certain level of knowledge. And when we come across things that we expect, we pay attention to that, but not to the same extent as we do to ideas we don't expect. Imagine driving along the road, and you drive along the same road, for example, every day, and you see cows. And then one day you drive along the road and you see a purple cow. Of course, that would startle you, and you would pay attention to that cow in a different way. You may actually stop and look at it for slightly longer and ponder, why is that purple? Why is the cow purple? Where did it come from? What it means? And I'm borrowing this idea from Seth Godin as well, who's a marketing writer. And the idea is that when we're confronted with certain facts and ideas that we don't expect, we tend to pay much more attention. And that's important to bear in mind when considering what to include and what not to include in your policy brief. Ask yourself, what are the findings that are unexpected, or what are the recommendations that you may give that stand out, or that may have a lasting impact, and actually not many people have thought about them before? Or what are the certain trends or issues that you'd like to include in your policy brief that haven't been the dominant issue points raised before? So of course, if you have those ideas, it's helpful to know that these unexpected points that do raise people's attention, and maybe it's worthwhile including them in the very beginning, so that the audience may be curious to read further and to then see why this unexpected issue came up. Another point that relates to the principle of unexpectedness, and that's the knowledge gap. So readers are curious to read on, to continue reading something, if they realize that it helps them address that knowledge gap. It's kind of like having an itch. You want to finish until you know how it ends. It's why we watch sometimes movies that we may not like, but may spark our curiosity, and we want to see how they finish. Or why we read a mystery story, something that captured us in the introduction, we want to see how it finished. And that principle is helpful when thinking about, again, structuring the information that we want to put in the policy brief, thinking about how can we capture attention and point to that potential knowledge gap. By either phrasing things in an interesting way in our titles and subtitles, or phrasing things in the beginning of the paragraphs in such a way that it leads the reader to finish what they're reading, because it helps to address that knowledge gap. And the third principle, in addition to simplicity, to having the core message and unexpectedness, is the principle of concreteness. And the principle of concreteness means including, people are drawn to, concrete examples. So having something concrete makes them relate better. So providing a case study, or weaving into a story that is appropriate for the context and relates to the points that you're making, it helps to then demonstrate that point much more. And here it's also, placing your numbers, if you have them, if you have statistics into the context. Comparing certain number, or this is comparable to the number of people in Germany, or placing figures and statistics, as well as certain descriptions that you have into the context of real people and real numbers, again, strengthens it and helps people remember it. In other words, makes your ideas stick here. The fourth one is credibility, and here it helps if whoever reads your work has respect and knows that what you've done is based on solid methodology, for example, and it builds on a certain data that is well respected. Emotion is the fifth principle. Again, this may not be always applicable to policy briefs, but in general, the book discusses that idea that people are emotional human beings, and obviously when ideas are communicated in such a way that they touch people's emotions, they're likely to act, and they're likely to remember what you have to say, and it's part of the impact. And the last point is this point about having a story. And that is, once you've done that work, you've thought about your core idea, you've thought about what is maybe unexpected about your findings, and you've touched upon different elements we discussed. Then step back and think about, does it make it into a coherent story? Because all of those parts have to make sense as together. So you begin at one point, and you have to kind of make sure that in the end it all makes sense. And here it's just kind of a simple chart to demonstrate that, again, not all of these points on the checklist may be applicable to your policy brief, but it surely helps me personally when I think about structuring a storyline for a policy audience or any audience, to think about how you make your ideas impactful and so to speak, sticky. Now, there are different types of policy briefs. We're not going to go into great detail about them, but it's important to keep in mind that as you come across them, you may see, oh, this is a much longer one than I thought we discussed, or this is a much shorter one. And of course, some of you already may have a lot of experience in writing policy briefs, so I may be really preaching to the choir here. But But it's important overall. I separate them into categories of having a really brief one, so something kind of like a one-pager that quickly communicates the message, and if the reader is interested, you can have a link where the reader can download a full report or a full article. And then having something in between, 2 and 4 pages, and something that we'll talk more about today. And then obviously there are longer briefs. So we'll talk about the 2 4-page briefs, but in terms of why each brief is different lengths, again, it depends on the purpose. So if you're sending us a quick message-led policy brief one-pager to a very, very busy policymakers to a wide variety of audiences, this may target kind of a lot of different people in different jobs, and they may follow up with your information further. Whereas a longer brief, you may want to send to someone who is well versed in the topic, but may not necessarily be researching it full time, and so you may send them a longer version. Whereas one in between can target both audiences really. So here we created a template, and I've used one of the policy brief by Agnieszka Weiner, who's kindly agreed for me to use her work for this. And this one is on mobility partnerships. So as you can see, this brief is, well, it has a title, it's a 2-column brief. It has an abstract in the beginning, and that captures people's attention. And you can see that it leads in the end in the abstract. You have some question. It raises some questions that any reader may want to answer, so to fit their knowledge gap. And then it has subsections. So we'll talk about them separately. In fact, this is how it looks. So it's a 3-page brief, and you can see. I mean, this snapshot is not designed for you to see all the details of this brief, but just rather for you to quickly glance at the structure, so that you can see that it has subsections which have 2 or so paragraphs each. Paragraphs are not that long because you can see that it's a 2-column brief, so they have to be to the point. And you can also see that in the end there are some sources provided, but it's not a lot of sources. So it's not a traditional academic paper with much more sources. Okay, and then let's move on, and then we'll discuss about how to construct each section in more details. So the do's and don'ts actually links to this brief as well, so I will talk about that. We'll return to this template again very soon. The first thing in terms of do's is think about your policy brief and your policy story early on. And that's basically as soon as you begin your research, have it in mind if you need to write one or if you want to write one. And as you start seeing certain patterns and findings, think about what is unexpected, what are potential impacts of your research, and place it into that context. Again, ask yourself, what is the core message? How is your research linked to the policy context? And that's why it's important to think about your policy brief early on as you do your research, because you may find certain things happening as you do your research in the policy world that may be very much linked to your work, and it's worth keeping them in mind, because then it helps you to structure your policy briefs in such a way that addresses that context. And just to return to that point, in terms of the context, you may have a broader context, for example, the fiscal crisis in Europe, debate about cutting budgets, and you may have a more narrow focus pertinent to your area, for example, what is happening to the integration projects in different member states, or what is happening to the asylum policy. So it's broader than your immediate research question, and you need to kind of keep in mind those 2 different types of contexts when trying then to construct your brief. Another useful tip that actually was given to me was try to cut your work in 50% without losing the core meaning. And it's easier than it's easier sounds than it actually is done in practice. but it's helpful when then trying to put together a shorter policy brief. So trying to cut it by 50%, and then it helps you then to zoom into that core message even more. It's important to create interesting and action-oriented titles and headings, and keep in mind the points that we discussed in making your ideas stick. And that's kind of the unexpectedness, the emotion, or certain points that kind of captures people's attention by pointing to the gap in their knowledge or potential gap in their knowledge. But it's really important to have catchy titles. For example, in the brief that, in Agnieszka's brief that we're using as an example, the title Mobility Partnerships, what impact do they have on legal migration and mobility? I mean, obviously, anyone who's interested in mobility partnerships or the impact they have would want to read on, because it already kind of captures the question for us. So it's not just simply, for example, having just a title, Mobility Partnerships, or, just more noun-driven title. It's much more action-oriented and question-oriented title, which seems to be more effective. This is a sub-question in one of the sections. What is the future of legal migration and mobility partnerships? It's a thought-provoking question. It's a challenging question. It's something which may have been debated already, but it definitely captures attention and wants me or other readers to continue reading. Another useful tip in terms of do's, and that is keep it simple and keep it calm. And that's just pertains to the outline and the structure and the way you you use fonts and you structure your information, because the point here is to use a template or to use as simple of a font as you can to highlight only messages that are really, really worth highlighting without creating kind of font-based mess, because then it distracts the reader from your core points. Make it as easy as possible for your readers to see the information that you want them to see. Avoid distractions, and I'll show you quick examples. And this again pertains to fonts and to the outline of your briefs. So for example, this is a brief that we're looking at as an example. Again, it's a simple outline. We have a few colors, but they're not too many, and it's easy to read. This is what I did to change it slightly, just to demonstrate the point. Here we have much more distractions, and it's not as simple and calm as the one shown before. So you have mobility in one color. Apologies. You have legal migration in a completely different color. You have mobility partnerships is in italics and underline. And then later on in the section, in the second column, you have legal migration mobility highlighted. Some things are bigger. So in other words, it's an exaggerated way for me to demonstrate the point that the easier and calmer fonts and styles can be much more effective in communicating message. And it helps your reader to focus on your core message without having their brains work hard at why this is highlighted and this is not highlighted. Obviously, some things may need to be highlighted or noted, but they need to be logical and not too many of them, because then it really serves more as a distraction. So now let's talk about this template that we have in more detail, and how to turn a research paper into a policy brief. Now here, this is a template that I also used for Agnieszka's brief. And here, this is just an outline. You can see that the top header, you have organization where you're writing this policy brief for. Then you have a date. You can choose, how specific you want to be. Then in the first column, you have title. Again, remember to have catchy titles. Abstract, and here we put together kind of percentage of the overall length of the brief. And it's not set in stone, obviously, but it's helpful in trying to then gauge how much information you need to put into each section. So abstract is about 10%. And we'll look into each section in detail after this. Then you have introduction, you have methodology, so helps to communicate your credibility, and you have results and conclusions, and you have implications and recommendations, and you have concluding remarks and sources for further reading. Okay, I will try to speak slower in case there are any technical problems with hearing me, and please raise your hand or communicate it if you do. So the abstract. Again, the abstract is about 10% of the overall length of your policy brief. And when writing an abstract, think of the following question. Why is the topic relevant for the target audience? Again, we've touched upon that in the beginning of the presentation. What is the main argument of your brief? What is the policy solution and recommendations that you want to communicate? Then you have introduction. Introduction is also fairly short. It's 10 to 15% of the overall length, and it highlights the urgency of the issue. It communicates that context that we discussed, both maybe broader and more immediate one, and how then your research fits into that context. It gives a brief overview of the conclusions and key recommendations. So if someone reads just the introduction and the abstract, they still get the idea of where you're taking argument and what you're about to argue. And it gives an overall direction and outline to the rest of the brief. Then there is a section on methodology, which in some briefs may be omitted. It depends on the style, but if it's included, it should be brief, between 5 and 10% of the overall length of your policy brief. Is designed to strengthen the credibility that we mentioned is important as well for making your ideas sticky. And again, you may think about how much information you need to put in, whether methodology is important or not. But you can include a few sentences about where you drew your data, whether you've used interviews or certain data sets. That then helps the reader to know where you draw your conclusions from. Section 2, results and conclusions, is very important. It's one of the core sections of your brief, and that's why it's about 30% of the overall length. And here it is designed to give an overview of the findings of your research, and it should be aligned well with the policy recommendations as well. So in this section, again, think back to the principles that makes your ideas remembered and sticky, because here you can really think about what is new or what is unexpected, and make sure to include those things in this section. Section 3 is also very important because then it draws on this question apologies, of so what? So what are the implications and recommendations from your core findings? It's also about 30% of your overall length. And here, try to think in threes, generally, more or less. So what are the top 3 recommendations? What are the top 3 implications of your research? But make them direct and clear and action-oriented as you can. But of course, some policy recommendations are more applicable to be action-oriented than others. Use your judgment, but it is helpful to see how then to move from theory to practice, and what it means for policy practice recommendations that you may have. Concluding remarks, that's the point about a story, looking back and making sure, does it make sense, where you began and where you finished. It shouldn't be too much of a problem because the brief is not long paper, so but still don't take that for granted. Look back, ask a question, so what? What is the overall core message, and what is the most useful for the audience?
Yeah.
And then sources of further reading. It helps readers find out more about the issue. Again, this is not your complete bibliography of your research, entire research. Use the sources that you put in here selectively. Only if you need to cite something, refer to certain data that may be controversial or that you rely on a lot. and in other cases, suggest further reading. But of course, don't have, if your brief is only 3 pages, it's probably not too much justifiable to have 3 pages of your sources. Graphs and figures, it's quite an effective way to communicate your core message, but only if the graphs and figures are done in such a way that they communicate your core message. And there are several books and materials and graphs and figures that I won't go into detail in this presentation, but bear in mind that, again, the core message is the one that should drive the selection of the graphs and figures that you choose. Don't use too many, because obviously they will also take space. It depends on the topic and the messages of your brief, but in general, try to aim for 2 figures or graphs per brief. And in this chart, I chose it to make it because it kind of communicates the overall length of each piece. So here, if you can see clockwise that 30 and 60% of your brief should be devoted to results, conclusions, and implications and recommendations of your research. So given that, think early enough and careful enough about these issues and try to structure them in a way that capture people's minds, because they're the bulk of your research. But of course, introduction and conclusions, even though they're short, they're important because that's maybe the first things that your readers may pay attention to. So this is additional reading. Some of it relates to the policy brief, but lots of it is not. It's just about general communicating your ideas effectively. Information is beautiful, is useful for thinking about how to present your information visually in effective ways. And then the perfect, other ones are about just ideas about persuasion, and if you have to present something in oral forms. And the second book from the bottom, the visual display of quantitative information, as well as the last one, Say It with Charts, is particularly helpful when trying to think about graphs and figures and how to choose which type of graph to make for the core message that you have. These are the links to the images that I've used. And if you have further information, of course, email me, but also you can have questions in the end of this presentation. I apologize, we've gone a bit over time, but I think there were some technical issues as well that we tried to pay attention to as we went along. So now I'll turn over to Nehas, who will moderate the questions.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Can all the attendees please raise their hands if they can hear me properly? Okay, great. Now, I was wondering if anybody had any questions. Can you please raise your hand once again if you have any questions? Then we can go one by one if you want to ask anything to our presenter today. Okay, great. Let's start with our first question. It is sent by Geeta Horani. She has asked that much of the information that you suggested we include in a policy brief, but we usually have in the executive summary. Will it be a good idea to turn the executive summary into a policy brief? Svetlana, would you like to answer the question?
Yes. Well, I think executive summary is definitely a helpful point to start, because it already forces one to think in those lines that we've covered in this presentation, and that is, what is the key message, what sources one uses, and what is surprising. And executive summaries, the longer reports in particular, are written for the purpose of capturing readers' attention and summarizing the core points for those who will not potentially read the entire report, or helping people to decide whether to read the entire report. So from that perspective, executive summary may be a very good starting point for for choosing to write a policy brief. But policy brief also does goes steps further. So, whereas in executive summary you may be hinting more at some of the findings and summarizing them briefly, in your policy brief you may elaborate on them a bit more. In executive summary, you are compelled to give an overall view of the entire report. In your policy brief, you may choose not to include certain things at all. So you don't have to include everything from your research. You may choose certain parts of your research that's just for that policy brief. For example, if you have a research on this mobility partnerships, as a overall, you may do research on circular migration and include different countries as your case studies. And for policy brief, you may just write about one element of that or one case study that stands out. So it's very much depends about what is the purpose of your policy brief. If the policy brief is aimed for you to have to summarize your overall research and it's appropriate for that, then of course use your executive summary as much as you can. However, if your policy brief is aimed only at certain parts of your research, then of course you need to think much harder and try to redo it and focus only on that element. If you choose the latter, and that is use only a part of your research for policy brief, then try to avoid maybe simply referring back to executive summary, because it's an easy way, but it may actually be not as effective in trying to put together a policy brief, because here you need to start thinking again, so what is very interesting about this particular point of your research and what implications it has, and so on. But again, if you choose the first option, that is use your entire research findings base for policy brief, then executive summary is quite handy to use. Does this answer your question?
Geeta, does that answer your question, or do you have any further queries? Okay. Are there any other questions? You can type in and send me your queries right away. If you have any questions, could you please send the message? You can type in the question in the question panel, and the presenter will get back to you as soon as possible. Oh, by the way, I just wanted to inform everyone that the presentation itself, plus the examples, will be emailed to everyone. So do not worry about that. And this particular webinar will also be available online on our website, and you'll be informed about it as soon as possible. So you will get the samples of the policy briefs that were used during the session, plus the entire presentation made by Dr. Kobzar today. Is there any other question that you might have? I see still a few hands raised. So if you would like to ask your questions, you can do it right now. All right, great. So I think that would be the end of this session. Thank you so much, Dr. Kobzar, for joining us for this session. Thank you, and thank you all the audience for your questions and for listening to this presentation. If you have any queries later, you of course can either email me, or you can email Dr. Kobzar directly for any kind of queries regarding this session. And of course, I would be really appreciating your comments regarding the quality of the video, the topic itself, and if you had any audio issues during the presentation, any kind of problems that you would like, any suggestions to improve the webinar. There will be a survey just right after this session, and I would be very happy if you could kindly fill out your comments and ideas so that we can improve our webinar. For our next session for the webinar, we will again advertise for the positions, the vacancy for the seats, and if you have any ideas about topics or any relevant issues that you want us to address in our webinar, please do get in touch with me. You can use my email address, that's neha.sanat@eui.eu, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you, Dr. Koltsar, very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity.
And thank you everyone for your attendance in this webinar. Goodbye.